The work order that morning, said Cargo Bay 7, Inner Hull Section. Routine remanifest on the Sorrow's secondary food stores before we hit the corridor way station at Velthresh. 6 of us. Me, Corporal Adazan Wachukwu, Specialist Tomas Arriaga, Specialist Priameta, and the 2 youngest members of our crew, Jace Holloway and Fen Calloway, both of them barely 22, and both of them trying very hard not to look impressed by the scale of the Ashgavar Reach's largest registered clan. Liner. I didn't blame them. The Vethkai Sorrow was enormous. 11 decks, 940 meters stem to stern, registered capacity of 1,400 souls on a clan-run transit route that had been in continuous operation for 6 of the Ashgavar's generational cycles. We were 3 days out from the Reach entry point, running the corridor lanes that cut between the outer belt systems and the Velthresh hub, and the light that came through the hull viewports on Deck 6 was the long amber color of the Reach's midday star, warm and thick, and almost orange through the filtered glass. The kind of light that felt substantial, like it had weight you could lean against. The Sorrow was not a military vessel. She was not even a vessel with significant military capacity. She was a clan liner. The kind of ship the Ashgavar Reach clans used to move entire family cohorts between their territory nodes, carrying everything from the elderly down to the youngest cubs. The Ashgavar were hierarchical in a way that took some getting used to. Warrior caste on the upper forward decks, the matriarch's retinue on Deck 2, council members and senior clan lineages in the midship quarters, and below midship, in the lower decks where the corridors got narrower and the amber light thinner, families, children, the clan young in their creche quarters, the elders who traveled with them, the domestic service workers, most of them drawn from contract labor pools across 6 species, us. I want to be precise about that, because it matters for what happened later. The Ashgavar did not disrespect us. They were not cruel, they fed us well, paid on time, and the warrior caste, who ran security on the Sorrow's upper decks, were not unkind when they passed us in the corridors. But they did not see us. 6 humans on a 1,400-berth clan liner, hired to remanifest food stores and run maintenance checks in the lower cargo sections for a 2-week transit. We were furniture with work orders, the matriarch's household staff, the warrior caste officers, the Ashgavar council members who took their morning tea on Deck 3 while the amber light came through the panoramic windows. None of them would have been able to name one of us. Not one. Soravak, Reach matriarch of the Vethkai clan liner, had amber pelt the color of the midday star that lit the corridor. She was broad-shouldered, heavy-boned in the way the Ashgavar leadership caste always were, and she moved through the ship with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once in her life needed to wonder whether the floor would hold her. I had seen her twice in 3 days. Both times, she had looked through me the way you look through a cleaning cloth, not hostile, not contemptuous, simply absent, in the way your eyes slide past something that registers as background furniture, rather than as a person. I thought about that later. I thought about it a great deal. We were in Bay 7, 3 hours into the remanifest ship, when the ship's alarm architecture did something I had never heard it do before. Not the rolling 3-tone standard distress, not the 2-pulse hull breach protocol. What it did was a single flat tone, sustained, at a frequency that made the fillings in Arriaga's left molar vibrate. He pressed his jaw and looked at me, and I was already moving, because I had done 4 years of convoy escort work before I took the contract labor certification, and I knew what a combat intercept alarm sounded like in its bone resonance variant. The U.S. Key had used that frequency since the Outer Belt surveys. It wasn't standard among the Reach clans, but the hardware that produced it was treaty shared, and the Sorrow had been running U.S.-compatible navigation arrays since her last refit. Something had locked onto us from outside. Bay doors, I said. Now, Nwachukwu had them cycling before I finished the sentence. The heavy blast doors of Bay 7, sealed with the pressure seal thud that you feel in your sternum. For a moment we stood in the sudden quiet and listened. Through the walls, through the hull itself, transmitted in the low-frequency chatter that big ships carry in their bones, I could feel something. Impact signatures, rhythmic, purposeful. The kind that didn't come from debris or system failure, the kind that came from things with intentions. Boarding pods. Arriaga, I said. Pull the ship, schematic from the maintenance console. He had it up in 40 seconds. I studied it the way you study something, when you have 40 seconds before the picture changes, and you need to hold the whole of it in your head. The Vethkai Saros defensive architecture was warrior cast forward. The upper hull, the bridge approaches, deck 2, all of it was hard-shelled, internal bulkheads, and reinforced approach corridors that the Ashgavar military designers had built for exactly this kind of threat. The Reach corridor was pirate territory. It had been pirate territory for generations. The Dhuvrak raider caste operated in it the way a predator operates in the territory it knows best, picking off clan liners in transit between the way station points where the patrol density thinned. The Saros warrior caste was 48 soldiers, experienced, well-equipped, trained by a culture that had been fighting Dhuvrak raiders since before humans had managed controlled flight. They were good. I had watched them run drills on the upper deck on each of the 3 days of transit. They were very good. The Dhuvrak knew this. They had boarded here before. They had done this before. The maintenance schematic showed me 3 boarding pod impact points, all of them forward. All of them on the hull sections closest to the warrior caste quarters and the bridge approaches. The Dhuvrak were hitting where the Ashgavar expected. They were drawing the warrior response forward toward the breach points on deck 1 and 2. A deliberate concentration that would pin the entire defensive capacity of the ship at the end of the vessel furthest from the family quarters. Ariagas saw it at the same moment I did. He put his finger on the schematic without saying anything. Deck 5. The family quarters corridor, one approach route from the mid-hull sections, a service corridor that ran from the Saros secondary engineering block straight to the Deck 5 residential section. It passed through Cargo Bay 9, 2 bays down from us. It was the kind of corridor that existed, because ships needed maintenance workers to move between sections, without crossing the main passenger corridors. It was the kind of corridor that nobody defended because nobody was supposed to be able to reach it from a boarding action without first punching through the warrior caste on deck 1 and 2. The Dhuvrak were not trying to punch through the warrior caste on deck 1 and 2. That was the point. That had always been the point. They were keeping the warrior caste busy, while a secondary team moved through the ship's service for structure toward the section of the Sorrow that mattered most. The section where the clan's children were. They're going to try the service route, I said. Nwachukwu was already looking at the manifest logs, pulling up the last bay check on Bay 9. Bay 9 doesn't have a blast door on the service corridor end, she said. The maintenance records show it was flagged for upgrade 18 months ago. It's still open. Standard interior partition, not a pressure door, Holloway said. The warrior caste will redirect. The warrior caste has 48 soldiers and 3 active boarding breaches on the upper hull, I said. They are not redirecting. They can't. The moment they pull force from the forward breach points, those decks are lost and the raiders reach the bridge. I looked at my crew, 5 faces in the amber emergency light of Bay 7. Nwachukwu, who had done 2 years of commercial convoy security before I did, and who was already calculating distances on the schematic. Ariaga, who had a machinist's ticket and a very practical understanding of how things were built, and therefore how they broke. Meta, steadiest person I had ever worked beside, currently looking at me with an expression of complete professional calm that I found deeply, specifically reassuring. Holloway and Calloway, both young, both pale in the amber light, standing very straight in the way that people stand when they understand that the next several minutes are going to be the most important minutes they have ever spent, and they want very much to be adequate to them. I was a contractor, a remanifest crew chief. My job description was food stores and maintenance checks and the careful documentation of consumed inventory. My weapon was a service sidearm, standard issue contractor authorization, effective to maybe 40 meters in a corridor with clean sightlines. And I had one. Meta had the other. That was the sum of our armament. 2 service sidearms and 6 people in contractor coveralls in a cargo bay that smelled of synthetic polymer and coolant, and the particular dusty warmth of stored food containers. We have 2 sidearms and a cargo bay full of equipment, I said. The service corridor has 1 approach. We get to Bay 9 before they do, We seal what we can, and we hold the corridor until the warrior caste can redirect, or until a rescue asset arrives. Nobody argued. I want to record that clearly, because I have been asked about it many times since, and the answer is always the same. Nobody argued, and nobody hesitated, and nobody took a long look at the blast door and thought about the mathematics of 6 unarmed contractors versus a Dhuvrak boarding cadre. We were there, the children were on the other side of that corridor, and that was the whole of the calculation. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, the simplest thing I have ever participated in. Nwachukwu unslung the equipment bag and started pulling cargo restraints and maglock clamps from the Bay 7 storage rack with a speed and focus that made me want to promote her on the spot. Arriaga went straight to the power tools, the plasma cutter, the hull drills, the heavy torque wrenches. Meta checked her sidearm, holstered it, and picked up a plasma cutter with the expression of someone who had just decided what it was going to be used for today, and it was not going to be cutting cargo container seals. Holloway looked at the tool rack for 1 second, picked up a heavy cargo wrench, 40 centimeters of machined steel, the kind used for torquing the primary container lock rings, and followed me to the door without being asked. Calloway grabbed the magnetic clamp kit and the secondary cable spool, and was at the door before Holloway finished, checking his grip. The corridor between Bay 7 and Bay 9 was 200 meters of lower deck service passage, amber lit in the emergency setting, pipes and cable runs along the ceiling, the floor grating resonant with the ship's vibrations. I could hear the battle through the hull now. Not individual sounds, but the aggregate of it. Cushion of weapons fire filtered through 3 decks of structural material into something that sounded less like combat and more like weather, a distant storm. Moving fast, getting louder, we reached Bay 9 in 4 minutes. The service corridor on the far end was open. The blast door, the one flagged 18 months ago for an upgrade that never came, the one that sat in a maintenance log that nobody below the warrior caste rank of logistics officer ever looked at, was a standard interior, Titian, not a pressure door, not a bulkhead seal. I engaged the manual lock on it with the handle of Arriaga's cargo wrench, threaded through the lock bar. 3 minutes, maybe, against a cutting torch. Maybe less if they were carrying good equipment. We worked. I'm going to tell you what we did in the next 17 minutes before the Dhuvrak arrived at that corridor, and I want to be clear that none of it was elegant or strategic in any way that a military tactician would recognize as such. We were not soldiers, not trained for corridor defense. What we had was the particular practical intelligence of people who spent their working lives understanding how objects and materials and spaces functioned, and 6 people who were, in that moment, operating at the precise outer edge of what human beings are capable of, when the thing behind them is the thing behind them. Arriaga used the plasma cutter to score and fracture the corridor floor grating for 30 meters in front of the partition door. Not deeply. Not enough structural integrity, because compromising a ship's structural integrity in transit is the kind of thing that turns one crisis into 2. But enough to catch and bind the feet of anything moving fast in poor light, enough to create a surface that punished running. Calloway ran the cargo restraints, heavy polymer webbing, the kind rated for container loads in excess of 4 metric tons, across the corridor at knee height, ankle height, and chest height, anchored to the pipe runs on either side with the magnetic clamps. These were not trip lines in any sophisticated sense. They were obstacles, and obstacles in a corridor bought time, and time was the only currency we had. Met and I established positions behind the Bay 9 storage racking. 4 meters of stacked container units that gave us cover, elevated sight lines down the first 30 meters of corridor, and enough structural mass to absorb a weapons discharge without cooking whoever was behind it. Nwachukwu cut the main lights and switched to the bay's emergency amber, reduced visibility to perhaps 15 meters from either direction, but gave our barricade position an additional margin of shadow that the emergency lighting geometry couldn't resolve. Holloway stood in the shadow of the secondary stack, with the cargo wrench in a 2-handed grip, and said, quietly, "They're going to have to come in single file." "Yes," I said, "that's good for us. That is very good for us." Partition door held for 6 minutes, not 3. Whoever was on the other side had equipment better than I'd estimated. A high-grade cutting, rather than the emergency kit burner I'd planned for. And they worked methodically, with the disciplined patience of a team that had done service corridor approaches before, and understood that rushing a lock cut produced ragged edges, caught in the worst moments. The light that came through as the cut progressed was not amber. It was the blue-white of tactical illumination, sweeping the corridor on the deliberate pattern of a team announcing itself to nothing, expecting nothing. They did not expect anything to be there. I do not know what the Dhuvrak boarding cadre was expecting on the other side of that partition. They had run this lane before. They knew the Sorrow's schematics from previous engagements or purchased intelligence. They knew the lower deck service approach was a designated non-defensive space with no assigned personnel and no heavy equipment. They were a specialist team. 7 of them came through in the first breach, moving fast and low in the compressed, efficient movement of people who had practiced this entry until it was muscular memory. The first 2 hit Arriaga's scored floor grading at full movement speed in limited visibility and went down badly. The kind of fall where your body's momentum carries you past your feet, and the floor comes up faster than reflex can compensate. The third hit Calloway's ankle height restraint at a flat run and went down face first with enough force that I heard it from behind the racking. The fourth cleared the first restraints and walked directly into the chest height line that Calloway had run across the corridor at the precise height where someone moving at a fast crouch would not see it until their chin found it. Meta shot the 4th one. I shot the 5th. We were not trying to kill them. I want that clearly on the record. Because it matters. And because the after-action documentation matters. And because the kind of person I am matters to me even in cargo bay corridors with polymer restraints and a plasma cutter. We were trying to stop them. In a narrow corridor with limited visibility and 2 sidearms between 6 people, stopping power was the only metric that functioned. The 6th and 7th pulled back through the breach. Arriaga was already moving on the partition door, using the cargo restraint anchors to bracket the cut section from our side, reducing the opening to a space that required the Dhuvrak to come through one at a time at a crouch. He worked with a methodical speed that I had always admired in him. The speed of someone who understood the physics of what he was doing and let that understanding do the heavy lifting. He didn't hurry. He didn't panic. He moved through each step of the improvised barricade construction the way he moved through every mechanical problem, which was to say, as if there were a correct answer and he was going to find it. They'll try to cut wider, Nwachukwu said. We know, I said. Let them try. They tried. It took them 9 minutes to extend the cut to a width that would allow a more comfortable breach. 9 minutes in which I had Holloway and Calloway pulling additional containers from the Bay 9 racks to extend the barricade's depth, and Nwachukwu repositioning to cover the breach from an angle that gave her a second sightline independent of mine. By the time the Dhuvrak came through a second time, there were 8 of them. They had moved the tactical illumination to a high mount angle designed to wash our sightlines from their approach direction, and the lead element was using a portable shield panel that was, clearly, standard issue for their boarding teams. When corridor opposition was anticipated, they had not anticipated corridor opposition. They had adapted to it in 9 minutes. That told me something about the Dhuvrak that I filed away for later, because respecting the competence of the people trying to get through your door is not the same as being afraid of them. And the latter was not something I had time for. That second exchange was harder. 2 of them got through the restraint lines, cleared them cleanly on the second attempt, having seen where they were from the first attempt. And one of them was excellent, fast, disciplined, full of personal protective equipment that made the sidearm hits count for less than I wanted them to count for. Nwachukwu took a strike from the shield panel's leading edge across her left shoulder that knocked her into the racking, with a sound that I did not enjoy hearing. The excellent one pushed through the hit from my second shot and got inside my arm's length. And there was a moment of close, ugly, immediate problem solving that I resolved by using the edge of the racking unit as leverage in a way that left me with bruised ribs and resolved Problem. Holloway used the cargo wrench. I am going to say that plainly because it deserves to be said plainly and without decoration. Jace Holloway, 2 years old, on his first off-world contract, swung a 40-centimeter machined steel wrench in a cargo bay corridor in the amber light of the Reach's midday star, and he did not stop, and he did not freeze, and he did not wait for someone to give him permission. He assessed the situation, and he acted on his assessment, and he was effective, and he kept going until the immediate problem was resolved, and then he stepped back into position and waited for the next immediate problem. I have supervised a great many people in a great many situations. Jace Holloway is among the best I have ever worked with. I want that on the record too. The Dhuvrak pulled back again. Corridor behind us was intact. The partition breach remained at the width we had bracketed. We held. The third exchange came 17 minutes later. They took longer between the second and third, which told me they were either reassessing their approach or waiting for reinforcement from the main boarding cadre. On the upper decks, came through on the third attempts, was not a larger group, but a differently equipped one. 4 of them, moving more carefully, with the tactical illumination shifted to a side-mounted position that gave them a sightline advantage I had not fully planned for. Meta was hit in the third exchange. Through the left forearm, an energy weapon grazed that didn't penetrate but burned deep enough to bleed, consistently and to matter. She tied it off with a length of cargo webbing that she cut with her belt knife while keeping her shooting hand free and sidearm in position. She told me it was fine. I looked at the webbing and the blood soaking through it, and then I looked at her face, which was completely calm and completely focused, and I took her assessment at face value, because that was what the situation required, and because Priya Mehta's assessments of her own operational capacity had never been wrong in my experience. The fourth exchange was the worst. Priyaga caught a tackle from a Dhuvrak who came through the breach at a different height than any of them had tried before. Low, almost prone, coming up fast from below the restraint lines in a way that cleared everything. Calloway had strung and drove Arriaga's back into the secondary, racking with enough force that I heard the crack of a rib from 3 meters away. He didn't go down. He planted his feet, grabbed the Dhuvrak by the front edge of the tactical vest with both hands, and used his own impact with the racking as a fulcrum to reverse the momentum in the most economical and effective way I have ever seen a machinist's training applied in a non-machinist context. Then he stepped back into position with his plasma cutter and kept working on the barricade extension, breathing in the shallow, deliberate way of someone managing pain by managing their focus. "Rib," I said when there was a moment. "It's fine," he said. "It is not fine." "We'll discuss it later," he said, in the tone of someone who has already decided how the discussion will end, and went back to the barricade. After the fourth exchange, there was a pause, longer than any of the previous intervals. 23 minutes. Long enough for Calloway to reset the ankle restraints that had been cut or torn in the exchanges, and to run a second cable line from the conduit that Arriaga had already stripped. Long enough for Nwachukwu, moving her shoulder carefully, to reposition our secondary cover point in a way that gave us a better angle on the breach width. Long enough for Holloway to say, very quietly, to no one in particular, that he had prayed during the third exchange. I thought about asking which god. I decided it didn't matter. Whatever he had prayed to, something had been listening. 314 children were still on the other side of that interior partition, in their emergency muster stations, listening to sounds they couldn't identify, and none of them had been touched. That was the answer to his prayer. That was the answer to all of it. The fifth approach never came. I heard it before I understood what I was hearing. The specific frequency that big ships carry in their structural bones changed. What had been the percussion of a contained boarding action, 3 decks up, forward, a sustained mechanical thunder filtered through hull material and decking, shifted into something that registered at a different pitch. Larger, external, not the Sorrow's weapons. Something had arrived alongside us. I stayed at the barricade. The corridor was still active, and I was not moving from the barricade on the basis of a sound I could feel, but not yet interpret. The Dhuvrak activity on our side of the partition went still. First, the tactical illumination cut, which I registered as a significant indicator, And then the sounds of movement ceased entirely. Not the silence of people massing for another attempt. A different kind of silence. The silence of a team that had received a signal it recognized and understood. Counter-confirmation came through the Sorrow's internal communication system 4 minutes later. Not directed at us. Not from anyone who remembered we were there. Because no one on the Sorrow's command structure knew we were there. It was the Warrior Cast tactical channel, which Arriaga had patched in from the Bay 9 maintenance panel at the start of all of this because, knowing what was happening on the upper decks, had seemed like the kind of information that might be worth having. The Dhuvrak were withdrawing, across all 3 boarding breach points, simultaneously, in the deliberate timed extraction of a unit that had received a stand-down signal and was complying with professional efficiency. The Warrior Cast was in controlled pursuit, and the Dhuvrak were moving fast. I learned later what had arrived alongside us. 1 frigate, human construction, U.S. Expeditionary Support variant, running on an emergency beacon intercept out of the Velthresh hub. The U.S. Grendel, with a crew of 42, and enough ordnance to make the Dhuvrak's probability calculations turn sharply negative. The Dhuvrak were opportunists, and opportunists were, at their core, mathematicians. When human fast response hardware appeared at a target they had expected to strip at leisure, the math changed and they left. That was the logic of it. That was the whole of the logic of it. 47 minutes from beacon to arrival. I looked at that number later in the after-action summary, and I held it for a while. 47 minutes. The 5 Dhuvrak assault teams on the upper decks had occupied the Sorrow's Warrior Cast for 3 hours and 53 minutes before the Rendel's arrival made the position mathematically unviable. We had held a cargo bay corridor for 3 hours and 41 minutes. We had been told nothing, directed by nobody, ordered to nothing. The Sorrow's command structure had not known we were there. The Warrior Cast had not known we were there. The Matriarch's household had not known we were there. The children on Deck 5 knew nothing at all. I checked afterward. The corridor approach to the family quarters was behind the second interior partition, the one we had been defending, and the civilian evacuation protocols had moved the Deck 5 occupants to the inner compartments during the first alarm. 314 of the Vethkai clan's young were in their emergency muster stations with their parents and their kreshminders for the full 4 hours, listening to sounds that were muffled enough by 3 layers of hull material and interior partition to be unidentifiable. Unsettling certainly, frightening perhaps to the youngest. But not reached, not touched. On the other side of a door that held because 6 people in contractor coveralls were on this side of it. I was standing in the corridor, back to the barricade, looking at the breach in the partition, at the cut edges still faintly warm, tactical illumination beyond it now dark. When I heard the blast door at the far end of Bay 9 cycle open, the one that led back into the main Deck 5 residential corridor, Reach Matriarch Soravak came through the door with 3 of her Warrior Cast, and 2 members of her household staff. The amber emergency light of Bay 9 fell across her the same way it fell across everything in this part of the ship. Warm and low and long-shadowed, and she walked through it with the absolute physical certainty I had noted before. The certainty of someone who had never needed to wonder whether the floor would hold her, whether the space she occupied was hers to occupy, whether the people around her registered her presence as fully as she registered theirs. Her pelt was perfect. Her household robes were unrumpled. She had been in the matriarch's secure quarters on Deck 2 for the duration, which was where protocol required her to be, and nothing about her appearance suggested that the last 4 hours had touched her at all. She stopped. I watched her take in the corridor, the barricade, the breach in the partition, cut edges glowing at the corners, the floor grating with its deliberate scoring, the polymer restraints, still strung at ankle and knee and chest height, the scattered cable from the conduit run, the residue of 5 exchanges written in the material record of the bay, the 2 Dhuvrak who were still in the corridor, alive, secured with cargo restraints, sitting against the far wall with their hands bound behind them and the resigned, professional expression of captured professionals waiting to find out what came next. And us. 6 humans, Nwachukwu with her shoulder held carefully, left arm pressed to her side, her face carrying the composed exhaustion of someone who had been moving through pain for 4 hours and was going to keep moving through it until she chose not to. Arriaga breathing in the shallow, deliberate way of a cracked rib managed by discipline, still standing beside the secondary barricade, the plasma cutter in his right hand. Meta with her forearm wrapped in cargo webbing, gone dark with blood, her sidearm holstered, expression the same complete professional calm it had been in Bay 7 when I made the call. And she picked up the plasma cutter and didn't ask a single question. Holloway and Calloway, both of them gray. The specific gray of people who have spent 4 hours at the outer edge of what they are capable of, and have found repeatedly that the outer edge was further than they thought it was, and are going to spend some time with that information before they know what to do with it. And me. Sorovak looked at us for a long time. One of her bodyguard began to say something in the formal Ashgavar register, the one used for official records and ceremonial address, and she held up one hand without turning to face him. A gesture so complete in its authority that the bodyguard stopped mid-syllable. She walked into the corridor, walked into the center of it, past the secured Dhuvrak, past the first restraint line. She stepped over with the precise care of someone who now understood what it was for and what hands had put it there. She walked to the breach in the partition and looked through it at the Dhuvrak side, at the dark corridor beyond, at the tactical illumination equipment still scattered on the floor where its operators had left it when the stand-down came. She stood there for a while, looking at the dark, then she turned around and looked at me. Not through me, at me. It was different, and the difference was complete. And I registered it with the part of my attention that I had spent 3 days telling to stop cataloging the ways. The Ashgavar aboard this ship did not see us. She was looking at me, and the looking had weight to it, and the weight was not authority and not assessment, or not only those things. It was something else, something that was trying to become words, and could not find them. Her eyes were the deep amber brown of the Reach's midday star. I had not been close enough to notice that before. I may not have been in any position where she was looking at me closely enough for me to notice it, because she had not until this moment looked at me at all. Her mouth opened, closed. Something moved in the amber-brown eyes, and in the set of broad shoulders, and in the muscles of a face whose expressional vocabulary I had spent 3 days learning to read from a distance. Something large was working in her, and it had no prepared channel to run through. The Ashgavar Reach had a framework for everything, for honor and debt and service and sacrifice and the formal acknowledgement of all of these. The matriarch of a clan liner had a formal register for addressing fought for the clan. She had a formal Fraudschaw for acknowledging acts of protection offered by clan members in distress. She did not have a framework for 6 contract laborers in cargo bay coveralls who had held the corridor to her children's quarters for 4 hours, because the corridor was open and they were there, and that was the whole reason. She looked at Nwachukwu, at Arriaga's careful breathing, Meta's wrapped arm, at Holloway and Calloway, both of them standing very straight because they were 22, and in front of a matriarch, and they were going to stand straight if it killed them, because that was the kind of young men they were. She opened her mouth again. I watched her try. I watched reach for the formal register and find that it didn't fit. I watched her reach for the trade language and find that it didn't have the vocabulary for the weight she was carrying. Watched her try 2 or 3 times, draw breath, face moving towards something, finding the shape of it, and each time, the shape dissolved before the words could come. Because there was no word in any register she had access to for what she owed. And knowing it, and having known that the debt existed for 4 hours while she sat in the secure quarters on Deck 2, and the people who were now standing in front, her had been in a cargo bay corridor on Deck 6. She looked at the floor. She looked at the scored grating, and the polymer webbing and the cable, and the repurposed container panel that Meta had cut and welded into a deflection surface. She looked at everything in that corridor except my face, and I understood, not as a judgment, as a fact, that she could not look at me. Not because she owed me nothing. 'Cause she owed me something that had no name in her framework and no mechanism for payment, and the weight of it stood between us like a wall. she had not known, was there until she walked into it. Senior Sword Officer Verith came forward from the bodyguard position and stood beside her. He was the Sorrow's chief of warrior caste security, 30-year veteran of the Reach corridor lanes, with the rank marks on both shoulders that indicated 3 previous Dhuvrak engagements survived, and a movement economy that told you, without needing to be told, that this was a man who had fought in corridors before. He looked at the breach in the partition. He looked at the barricade, the full architecture of it, the layered restraints, and the cable, and the scored grating and the container panel. He looked at Meta's arm and Nwachukwu shoulder and Ariaga's shallow, careful breathing. He said, in Reach trade language, each word placed with deliberate clarity, "How long were you holding this corridor?" 3 hours and 41 minutes, I said. Verith was quiet. He looked at the barricade again. He looked at the Dhuvrak against the wall, alive, secured, breathing, sitting with the resigned competence of professionals who had encountered something they had not planned for. Then he looked at Holloway, who was still holding the cargo wrench in the loose-handed grip of someone who no longer needed it, but hadn't registered that fact yet, and something moved in Verith's face that took a moment to identify, because it was the last thing I expected to see in the face of a 30-year warrior caste veteran looking at a 22-year-old with a cargo wrench. It was respect, specific, professional, genuine respect. The kind that passed between soldiers across species lines when one recognized in another the thing that made them the same, regardless of everything else. He said, "We did not know you were here." "I know," I said. "We did not send orders to this section." "I know." The family corridor approach. He stopped, looked at the breach again, continued slowly, in the tone of a man constructing an after-action summary out loud as he read the evidence of it. "We did not assess the service corridor as a viable approach route. The assumption was that a full-depth penetration of the mid-hull would require more than a standard boarding cangadre to accomplish before the warrior caste could redirect. We were," he paused, "we were incorrect in that assessment. The Dhuvrak committed a secondary team to the service approach while the main effort held your attention forward," I said. "It was a sound tactical plan." "Yes," he said, "it was." He looked at me directly. "You were a remanifest crew." "Yes, with cargo equipment." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. A long moment. Then he bowed. Not a diplomatic acknowledgement. Not the courtesy gesture of a senior officer directing something at a contractor. The full-depth bow of the Ashkavar warrior caste formal acknowledgement. The one with specific weight in their hierarchy. The one I had seen him give. The matriarch herself, on deck 2, at the morning council. He held it. Behind him, without being directed, the household staff bowed. The bodyguard bowed. Sorovak did not bow. She was still looking at the floor, still carrying the weight of something that had no framework to hold it. And I did not expect her to bow, and I did not need her to. What I needed from her was nothing. That was the truth of it. There was nothing I needed from Sorovak that she could give me, Tukes, because what had happened in that corridor had not happened because I needed something from her. I had sealed that breach because on the other side of the partition there were children, and the corridor was open, and we were there. That was the sum of it. That was the whole arithmetic. I nodded to Verith. Then I looked at my crew. "Meta," I said, "get that arm properly looked at." "Working on it," she said, and her voice was entirely, specifically, characteristically Meta. "Araka, the rib. It's fine. It is categorically not fine. Go now." Nwachukwu was already heading for the door. Holloway set the cargo wrench down on the top of the barricade with the careful placement of someone returning a borrowed tool to its proper location. Calloway looked once more at the breach in the partition, at the dark corridor beyond it, at the tactical illumination equipment still on the floor, and then looked away. And something in his face had changed in the specific way that 22-year-old faces change when they encounter the exact outer edge of what are capable of and find that the edge was further out than the edge they thought they had. We walked out of Bay 9. The Rendell's boarding party met us in the main corridor on deck 5, 6 of them in full kit, running a post-action sweep, and the team lead was a lieutenant I had never met, who stopped when she saw us and did the rapid disassessment of someone counting the injuries in front of her. "Contractor crew," she said. "Remanifest detail," I said. "Bay 7. Originally, she looked at Meta's arm, at Ariaga's posture, at the general condition of all 6 of us, the coveralls, the ozone smell, 4 hours still sitting on us like a coat that hadn't dried yet. Then she said, "The service corridor, Bay 9, that was you." Yes. She was quiet for a beat. Then, "We picked up the Dhuvrak secondary cadre in the mid-hull service runs when we boarded, 7 of them, pulling back hard." She paused. "They looked like they'd had a difficult day." "They had," I said. The lieutenant nodded. She looked at us one more time. All 6, in our contractor coveralls, with our emptied sidearms and our cargo tools, and the 4 hours still on us. Then she stepped aside and let us through. I filed the action report that evening from the Rendell's operations bay. Report was thorough and precise. I listed everything we had done, and every piece of equipment we had used, and every exchange in sequence, in the flat professional language that after-action reports required. Because flat professional language was what after-action reports were for. It listed Meta's injury and Ariaga's rib, and the performance of Holloway and Calloway in terms that were accurate and specific, and that said what needed to be said without saying anything that would embarrass them in front of people who hadn't been there. The Rendell's captain, Ashan Mir, read the report over my shoulder, through the last 2 pages of it. She set her coffee down when she finished, and looked at the summary section, without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "You had 2 sidearms, and a cargo bay," I said. She picked her coffee back up. "Right," she said. The Sorrow reached Velthresh 2 days later, running on a close escort from the Rendell the whole way. Mir made the call to accompany us through corridor tail without being asked, which was the kind of thing the U.S. Key fast response crews did that. The transit lane documentation never quite captured with the precision it deserved. I was at Bay 7 running a final equipment check and making notes on the inventory consumed. Cargo, restraints, cable conduit, 1 container panel, 3 plasma cutter cells, when Sorovak walked past. She was going to the matriarch's debarking corridor, which was 2 decks up and had no routing through the Bay 7 section of Deck 6. She was walking past Bay 7 because she had chosen to. She stopped, 8 meters between us. The amber light of Velthresh Station coming through the docking viewports, the same warm, thick light of the Reach's midday star that had been with us the whole transit. She was in her formal household robes for the debarking. Household staff were ahead of her and behind her, and they moved smoothly past her when she stopped, giving her the space that staff gave a matriarch who wished to be still. She looked at me. I looked at her. She was carrying something. I could see it clearly now. I had spent 3 days learning to read the Ashkoffer face from a distance, and I had learned a great deal more. 4 hours in Bay 9 in the specific way that extreme events teach things that normal observation cannot. She was carrying something large and heavy that had been sitting in her chest for 2 days, and had not gotten lighter, and she had walked out of her way to this corridor, because she needed to put it down somewhere, and this was the only place that made sense. I waited. After a moment, she said, in trade language precisely, choosing each word with care. "My children," she stopped. That was the whole sentence. My children. She didn't say what she meant by it. She didn't say, "I know what you did," or "I know what you protected," or "I know what you are." She said "my children" and stopped, and the 2 words had in them everything that came after them, all the weight of what she could not say in any framework she had. "They're fine," I said. "All 314. I checked. Something moved in her face. The amber-brown eyes went very bright for a moment. The Ashkavar equivalent of the moment in a human face just before relief is allowed to be relief, the moment when the held thing is finally permitted to be set down. She nodded, once, sharp, the formal nod of a matriarch acknowledging a report, then she walked away. I watched her go, watched the household staff close smoothly around her again, the formal procession resuming its shape, the amber pelt, and the broad shoulders and the absolute certainty, moving away down the Velthresh docking corridor, toward whatever the Vethkai Sorrow's next transit cycle held. I looked at my manifest tablet. Cargo restraints consumed, 47 standard units. Cable conduit, secondary grade, 80 meters. Hull panel, section, partial, 1. Power cells for plasma cutter, full charge, 3. I noted all of it. I noted it in the precise language of a re-manifest crew chief accounting for inventory, consumed in the course of a transit job, because that was what the form required. Forms required things for reasons, and the reasons were not always the same as the things that mattered, but they were not nothing. Arriaga appeared at the bay door, with his rib wrapped properly, and a cup of coffee from the docking terminal's dispensary. He handed one to me, without being asked, and leaned against the doorframe, and looked out at the Velthresh dock, where the Sorrow was at berth 200 meters away, enormous and intact in the amber light, and where the Rendell was at berth beside her, in the calm professional proximity of a ship that had decided it was staying until the job was completely done. "We're being rehired," he said. I looked at him. "Vareth came down this morning. Next leg runs Velthresh to Ashkavar Prime, 6 weeks through the Reach interior. He asked if we'd sign on for the full leg, double standard rate." A pause. He said the matriarch had approved it personally. I thought about Soravak in the corridor, looking at the floor, looking at everything in Bay 9 except my face. I thought about the amber eyes going bright for one moment in the docking corridor before the formal nod closed everything back down. "What rate?" I said, Arriaga told me. I coffee down on the manifest stand and looked at the numbers on my tablet. The inventory, the cable, and the restraints, and the panel. "The 4 hours. Yeah," I said. "Okay." Arriaga nodded. He drank his coffee and looked out at the dock in the amber light of the Reach's midday star, and didn't say anything else because there was nothing to say that needed saying. Nwachukwu's in. Meta's in. Holloway and Calloway both signed this morning. He paused. "Calloway asked me to ask you if he could put in a formal transfer from cargo crew to the security detail." "He can," I said. "I thought so." We stood there in the amber light and finished our coffee and didn't talk about the 4 hours, because the 4 hours didn't need talking about. The work order the next morning would say what it always said. Cargo detail, lower deck sections, teen transit manifest. It would not say anything about Bay 9 or the service corridor or the Dhuvrak cadre that had expected nothing on the other side of an undefended partition. The work order never said the things that mattered. That was all right. Just the things that mattered knew what they were. I picked up the manifest tablet and went back to work.